Okay, cool. Oh, and yes, first order of business, some housekeeping for general Maya use. I don't know if you guys noticed this, but when you open up Maya, it takes roughly 1,000 years before you can do anything because it has to load in this thing and load in that thing, and you think it's done, and then it's not done, and you're like, has it crashed? Is it frozen? And it just doesn't ever actually open up. So one thing you can do to speed up the process is go in and change what plugins it automatically loads and what plugins it doesn't automatically load. So with the stuff that we're doing for class and kind of a lot of development that you'll be doing for character stuff, you won't need several of these plugins. And don't worry, you can always re-enable these. It doesn't break anything. It's not uninstalling anything. It's just not automatically putting it into memory. So to modify that, you can come in here, go to Windows, System Preferences, and then Plugin Manager, and it'll bring up this big long list of stuff. So there are 4 things that I would recommend going ahead and unchecking. And all that means is that Maya won't automatically load it in the future the next time you open the program. The first is anything related to Bifrost. So if you type in BIF, just up here in the top search bar, it'll only have the kind of relevant plugins here. And so what Bifrost is Maya's particle rendering system. If you do need to render particles, like you're doing animation with particles, go ahead and turn them back on. But for character rigging, you're not going to need particles. And it is a huge amount of information and stuff to load into memory. So go ahead, uncheck those guys. That'll speed some stuff up. Another one that you can disable is called Mesh. Mesh is used for kind of procedural animation and kind of motion graphics. It would be like, kind of that Tron effect where you can like say, these are a couple models, do some crazy procedural animation stuff, and it would do like spirals and vortexes and things like that. So it's really neat. You won't need it for character or rigging. So you can turn that off. It'll speed some stuff up. Another one is the ABC stuff. So ABC export and import. So what this is a specific file type called Alembic. And Alembic files are used for transporting particle animation. So it like stores that specific bit of data. We won't need particles, and until you need particles, you probably don't have to have that, or until you need to export and import animations that have particles in it, you probably won't need your Alembic stuff turned on. So you can go ahead and disable that. And there was one other one, which was XGen. So XGen is hair and fur. Possibly might need it for character stuff. I wouldn't say that you need it during the character rigging process, but XGen is one of the tool sets in Maya that lets you kind of do some cool hair and fur modifier thingies, but it's pretty heavyweight, so you can go ahead and disable it. It'll speed it up. So after I disabled those things, I just installed kind of the latest version of Maya, just so I was working with the latest and greatest stuff. Really, I wanted to mess around with some of the new features. It took my load time from like 45 seconds to a minute down to like 15 seconds or something like that. So that's nice. I'd recommend doing that for class if you're opening and closing Maya a whole bunch, or just each day. It's nice to not have to wait 20 minutes for it to boot up. Cool. So first order of business will be some housekeeping things. So we had, dang man, it's a big window. Several requests for kind of talking about a couple things that we had covered during class last time. And then several people emailed me about like not really understanding how to attach a control to a joint and get the joint to do stuff. That's fine. I don't know that we covered it in great detail. I was planning on covering it in this class. So if that's confusing or you weren't able to get that working, that's fine. We hadn't gotten there yet. So that's totally cool. So let's see, if we were working with the hand rig here, go ahead and open that scene, which I guess maybe it is, maybe it's not. Desktop, hands rigged. So Aaron emailed with one thing, says, should I get the root joint and the combined hands reskinned before I try to work with the hierarchy? Then I have that all set. Do I start to work with the mill coding to get the other controls in place? So really, I don't think I specifically laid out the order that I would recommend doing things in quite yet. So thank you for bringing that up. The order that I see working and getting things set up in is, so combining the hands, I would recommend doing first. So one of the first steps you're going to do is make the hands a single object in your hierarchy by combining them. Then I would go ahead and get your joints laid out in the correct position. Here you go. Here's the joints being gigantic. So you can just come in here to display, animation, joint size, set to 1. Go ahead and make that 0.1 so they're a little bit easier to work with. Cool. So sorry guys, I get a lot of messages from work. So once you have your hands combined, you come in and you start to lay out your joints in space where you think they should be in relation to where your mesh is. Once you have them kind of in the right location, I would go through and make sure that all the joints are oriented the correct way. So that should be the next step. So maybe I should go ahead and just do a quick little notepad. So combine hands, then place joints in space. Go ahead and then orient the joints. And what I mean by orient joints, so this is making sure that each joint points at the next joint and that the rotations of all the joints are 0. So if you look here at this joint hierarchy, even though this joint is not, so in the world space, you know, you've got your plane that's flat, you've got your plane that's totally, God damn it. Maybe if I close this, there we go. If you have your plane that's flat, that's your, that's one of the planes. You have your plane that's vertical, that's usually the Y plane. And then you'll have a plane that's like a wall right in front of you. That's usually the Z plane. So those are how you would get your initial kind of spacing. And if this joint doesn't fall on any of those planes, it points a weird direction. And if I come in here and make sure that I'm set to object space, you can see that it's pointed in this weird orientation, but the rotations are all zeroed out. And so that's where the freeze transformation came into play. I made sure that this joint was pointing at the next joint, and then I clicked freeze transformations. That won't zero out the XYZ of the translates though. And that's fine. That's to be expected. The reason for that is because this joint is a child of this joint. And so there's no way to make those 0 unless you put that joint right on top of the other one. And that brings me to kind of a very important point about hierarchy. So when you're looking in your outliner, this group, you can see it's at the very top. So this is at the world level. So all of these numbers are in relation to the kind of world space. And if I make a new object, maybe it'll make a little more sense. So if I move this object over here, you can see that I've moved it in world space in the X direction and in world space in the Y direction. So what you're doing when you're starting to create these groups and hierarchies is you're adding in a new reference point. So right now, this sphere's reference point is the world. If I put it inside of a group, so now I just hit Control G, that's the shortcut for grouping an object. Now this sphere is inside of a group. So now this sphere is in reference in spacing to this group. So if I were to move the group like this, the sphere still is at 0, 0 inside of that group. And so if I click the sphere, you can see that all of its rotates and translates are still at 0, even though it's over here. And that's because the group has moved. So all the groups stuff isn't at 0. The group stuff is still related to the world space, which is -1 and 1 in the Y direction. I could rotate it as well, get some weird rotations going on. And that still won't change any of the numbers of the child because the child is underneath of that main group. So what we're doing with all of our controls is we're trying to make sure that the thing that we interact with, which is the spline, is it's insulated from all the weird positioning and rotation that we do to get it in the right place so that you can tell that this control is going to control this joint. That's usually why you want to put it in that place. In theory, you could have a control over to the side that and it's like nowhere near the thumb that controls the thumb. It wouldn't be very helpful and it would be pretty hard to animate. But in theory, you could do that. You could be like, when I rotate this thing, rotate this X joint, and it will perform correctly. However, it's going to be very difficult to work with. So the reason that we put it inside of all the groups is so that we can position it in the right place, and it's still going to have all these nice 0 values, which will be a little bit easier to understand because as you're doing animation, when you make a fist, you're like, oh, well, that's different than the rigging position, which is nice and open and flat. So I've changed it. So it shouldn't be 0 anymore. That makes sense. I'm going to pause there because that is an important point. I didn't cover it in huge detail last time, but the idea of this hierarchy is so that you're able to control the starting point for all your controls. Does that make sense? Thumbs up, everybody. If that's still not clear, if that's still not vibing, please let me know because that is an important point.
I guess like what happens to those numbers like when you start, because in our hierarchy there's like multiple groups. So what happens in those numbers when you start to like, so each time you make a new group, the original numbers just are frozen at that point, unless you move
Okay,
it
yeah.
inside the
Yeah.
group.
No, so all right, let's bring our sphere back. Boop, boop. Let's go ahead and 0 everything out and basically construct this how we would have one of our controls. So this is our top level group. I call it the Z group. You can call it whatever you want, but this is the group that I use to put the control where I want the control to go. Okay. Then inside of that, I have another group, which I call the K group, which is something that we're going to be covering today. This is so that you can add in what I call, or what people call macros. And for this specific instance, it's using set-driven keys. So this is able to add in some additional functionality without still not affecting the values on the main control itself. Okay. So now that this is all structured in this way, if you move the Z group, both the child and the grandchild follow, right? So both the K group, which is the child, and the sphere, which is the grandchild, both of those follow this group because they're underneath of it in the hierarchy. So both of their values won't change no matter what you do to this thing. So you can rotate it and do whatever you want to get it into the right place. The K group is still zeroed out and the sphere is still zeroed out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so then the Z group, actually, those numbers change, but then the other ones stay 0.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And that, yeah, so that should be the behavior that you're looking for when you're rigging. If you look at your Z group and it has a bunch of random stuff in it, or and it has a bunch of values that aren't 0 in it, that's to be expected. That's what that group is for. That's good.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember you covering like combining the hands first, and so I kind of already added joints, and so like, what do I have to go back and combine the hands, or is there a way to do that like after the fact?
Don't believe there's a way to do it after the fact, but you can save a lot of the work that you've done by using that copy weights operation. Do you remember me mentioning that last time?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I would recommend you do would be so just to be clear, the step that you're at, you are at the point now where you still have both of your hands, and have you attached or you've skinned both of your hands, so you've done paint weights for the left hand and the right hand?
No, I just like added the joints to the right hand and then like oriented them and everything, and then I started painting just the right hand.
Just the right hand. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
you can still save all that work that you've done after attaching. All you would need to do is kind of duplicate the left and the right hand, and then you can combine your new mesh that has been created. So let's cover that. Let's, so you would be at the point now where you have, where's my separate? Oh well,
Can I add an
underneath
additional
of,
question to that? So I'm in the same boat, and I also started with that first hand.ma,
Mhm,
and it doesn't have that root joint.
mhm.
Do you go over, like, is there a way to add that root joint if we've already skinned and painted the separated,
Yes,
non-rooted?
that is a little bit easier to do. So let me make sure that I don't forget to do that. I'll write it down. So adding a joint. Okay, so if you were at the phase where you have two separate hands, right? Come on. Go ahead and hide this original. So you've got this hand and this hand. Just make sure to select them both. Come up here to mesh, go to combine, and it will add these weird little groups, which are basically just the transform history from the previous object. You can get rid of that immediately by either clicking this little watch looking thing here in the poly modeling menu, which is delete history, or you can come up to edit, delete by type, history. And you'll see that those groups go away, and it also loses it removes the history from over here in the channel box. So that means this is a good place to start for a mesh. You don't ever want a bunch of transform history in there when you first start doing your skinning stuff. That's usually going to end in tears. So at this point, you could, with your new mesh, go ahead and select whatever the root joint is in your hand joint hierarchy. Then select your new mesh, and in the rigging menu, come up, go to skin, and then make sure that you've got kind of just the default stuff here. You can reset. I'll just keep it to 4. You don't really ever need more than 4. And then hit bind skin. And you can just test to make sure that it in fact did attach, wiggle some joints around, make sure that stuff is happening. Looks like it is. So now this is where you can save some of the work that you've already done with your paint weights operation. So your original hand, or your original meshes, you would just want to select both of them, or you can select one at a time. All you would need to do is select one of your old hands and then holding Control if you're on Windows or Command if you're on Mac, and select your new mesh, and then say skin, copy skin weights. And if you did that, it would, in theory, fix stuff. So it'll basically copy over all the work you've done. So now if I come in here and I move this, you can see that this finger is no longer all janky, which is good, right? So it would basically copy all the work that you've done on the right hand thus far onto the right hand on the new mesh that you make. Does that make sense? By the way, who asked that? I wasn't
That
able
was
to.
me.
Okay, Taylor. Okay.
That makes sense. And then, so do you have to like individually do each hand? I don't know if you covered this. Or like, do you copy from what you did to one hand and like paste on the other?
So if you've only done kind of custom painting on the right hand, it sounded like is what you said, or the left hand. I guess this is the left hand. So you had started painting this hand, this side.
Yeah.
Then that would mean that you don't have any kind of custom paint information on this side. So you wouldn't need to copy anything over to that side. You can just select the right hand and then select your new mesh and say copy skin weights, and it will put all the relevant work over here. The one thing you could do after that, if you did want to kind of reuse some of the work that you've done, would be the mirror skin weights tool. So in here inside of skin, mirror skin weights, make sure that it has, I think it's YZ would copy from right to left, and then from positive to negative. Is that correct? Let me double check. So if you've been working on the right hand, no, okay. So you would want to uncheck this option because you want to copy from the negative side to the positive side. So make sure that this is unchecked. And when you hit apply, what it will do is basically take the paint stuff that you did on this hand and stick it on the other side of your mesh, which is the left side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and before you would do that, you would need to add the joints in the other hand. Do you do that individually also?
No, because what should happen when you, well, do you have joints over here on the, in your rig?
No, I don't.
Okay, yeah, you would need to make sure that you basically have a duplicate set of joints over here on the other side. You can, so if you've gone to great lengths to lay out joints on one side and you haven't done joints on the other, what you can do is actually do a similar thing to mirroring weights, which is mirroring joints. So you can come in here into skeleton and say mirror joints. Actually, I can't believe I didn't think to mention this. It's just going to get you guys to lay stuff out by hand. Apologize. So this is another instance where naming comes into play and you can save a ton of work. So if you've named all your stuff over here and it's with a specific method, you should be able to easily kind of flip it and just swap one part of your name and not have to rename everything. What I mean by that is I've got over here an R right wrist, R pinky one, R pinky one, or R ring one, so on and so forth. And if I did a mirror operation, what I could do is say search for R underscore and replace with L underscore. So that would mean replace the front letter R with L's, meaning right and left. So if I were to now select my wrist joint, make sure that it's set to behavior across YZ, and I hit apply. It'll create an exact duplicate set of joints in a mirror position on the other side, and it will also replace that first part of the name. So now I have a right wrist and a left wrist, a kind of right pinky and a left pinky, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Man, I'm following. So I had a drawing teacher when I was in undergrad 1,000 years ago that had 3 phrases he would use over and over, and I feel like I'm turning into that. It was, does that help? Do you see what I'm saying? And like one other thing, and I used to just keep a little tick tally of how many times he said it, and it was hundreds of times. So I apologize if I keep saying, do you understand, or does that make sense? But it's the best way I know how. Cool. So then adding in a joint if you've already got things skinned. Yeah, so if you had a setup that was like, let's see. So go ahead and get rid of the controls. Combined hand. So you only have this. So is this kind of where you're at, Aaron, where you have kind of a wrist joint and some stuff here? You don't have
No,
anything at the wrist?
well, kind of, yeah, but I started with that first, um, the first document, and so like I have both of the hands,
Mhm.
all the joints in and orientated, and then I have all the skin weights painted, and so I'm just wondering if like, but I don't
Okay, so
have
you
that like
would, like you
joint.
have a set of joints over here too?
Yeah, I have joints on both hands and I have paint weights on both hands and everything is working fine. But
Uh-huh.
then now, like with the controls and everything, I feel like I'm missing parts because like the hands aren't combined and I don't have like the root joint.
Oh, okay. So you kind of you have a set of joints that's like that's over on this side, and I guess maybe it's mirrored and stuff. Anyway, it's like in the right position, and you
Yeah,
kind of custom painted all this stuff over here.
yeah. I custom painted both hands and have custom
Okay.
made both joints.
Okay, cool. Let me go ahead and undo one of the deletes that I did then. All right, so if you wanted to, you're basically here where you've got, I guess these hands are still separate. Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so they're like that, that. Okay, cool. So this is where you're at. And if you moved a joint, then your finger would move. Is that right?
Yeah, the finger moves
Okay,
with the joint.
cool. So that should be fairly easy to fix. And I don't even know if you need to go through the headache of adding the joint to the skin weights, because the root joint I don't think will actually affect any verts, but I'll go ahead and cover this anyway. So if you wanted to make a joint with a specific name, you can do it with a quick Mel script. I'll just suggest that as a possibility. So down here, you can type in like little one-off Mel commands, and the Mel command for joint is joint. And like we covered with our scripting stuff, -n is name. And then you can give it a name. So I'll just call it hand root. And if you hit enter, it'll make a joint. It's named hand root. I just find that faster than coming in, going to rigging, clicking a joint, making sure it's in the right place, and then like renaming it. Anyway. So yeah, once you have your joint here, you can select both of your wrists, and then holding shift, select that joint last, and then hit P. I hadn't used it in forever, or I had never done it from the menu in forever, but I did find where parent is. It's under edit, and you can say parent.
Okay.
And so now this root joint, both those are children of the root joint. So if you moved that thing, both kids would follow. And that's fine. I think certainly for this assignment, you wouldn't need any additional functionality. For future stuff, if you did accidentally forget a joint or you wanted to add another joint into your mesh that wasn't there to begin with, what you can do is select your mesh and then click whatever the joint is. And actually these aren't. Let me go back a step because these aren't attached yet. Boop, boop. Skin, bind skin. All right, so now if I move this, moves the hand, like that. If I were to move this joint, obviously nothing happens to the hands because there's no weight, but I'll do the step that I just mentioned, which is selecting both wrist joints and then shift selecting the root joint, hitting P, like that. Now, if I come in here and I right click, go to paint weights tool, you can see all of the currently attached joints. That's what this list is here. And you'll notice that there is no root joint. So if you did want to add the root joint, what you can do is select your mesh, hold shift, select the joint that you want to add, come up to skin and say add influence. Let's see, where is it? Edits? No. Edit influences, so it's a submenu. Edit influence and then add influence. Go ahead and activate the options box the first time you go through this, just so you can see what's going on. I would recommend actually doing this option when you add in a new joint so that you don't mess up any of the work that you have already done. If you don't have that checked, what it will do when it attaches that new joint is it'll try to add some influence how Maya sees fit, which means that it's subtracting influence from things that you've already spent a bunch of time fixing. So if you lock skin weights, what that does is it adds it in as a possibility, but it doesn't do anything to any of the other joints. So now if I hit add, I can come in here to my mesh and it should be here, hand root is now an option that you could paint stuff to if you wanted to. In order to actually do that, you have to unlock it, which is just clicking the little lock. So if you click that, now you could paint how you've been painting so far and add influence or subtract influence or add it into the hierarchy, whatever you want to do.
And everything is only influenced once, so it's not like the hand needs to be flooded in order for the root joint to be able to move the hand.
Correct. Yeah. So that's the power of joints, is basically because joints are always in this hierarchy, or hopefully you set them up in this hierarchy. If you move the wrist, the reason that the whole hand moves is because the wrist has some influence, which is here. And then this part has this influence, this part has this influence. And because those are all children of the wrist, it looks like the whole thing's moving, which is really nice. And same with the finger, like you rotate the first joint, the other two joints follow. So all the influence that's on those joints is inherited, you know, so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes
Cool.
sense.
Nice.
I have a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
So I've already parented the joints to the hand and I was doing some weight painting, but I realized one of my joints is just in the wrong spot. Is there a way to like unlink it so I can move the joint, or do I have to like start over?
In the past, yes. When I first started working with Maya back in 2008, now they've got this fancy tool called the Move Skinned Joints tool. So if you activate that, you can kind of shift it where it needs to go and then unshift it, and that's its new rotation, right? So that would be the tool that you can use to put the joint where you think it needs to go.
Okay, thank you.
I also have a question.
Sorry, one more time. I was hearing a lot of plates.
Sorry. I also have a question. So when I was skinning one of my joints, it like the finger, like I have like one of the fingers partially painted, but like when I rotate the finger down to simulate like, you know, testing a fist, it like the mesh itself starts to vanish into existence. Like it just gets smaller. Is that like an orientation problem, or like why does it do that?
That's a very good question. So I think it was Derek had asked if I could take a look at his file at some point during the class. I could take a look at yours as well, and anybody else, hopefully I can get to it. To make that happen, go ahead and upload whatever your working file is to that's not it, to the project directory here in project folders. So just into your folder in hand project. Go ahead and drop it in there. And after I run through one or two notes, we can take specific kind of scene questions and
Okay.
take it from there. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Cool. Okie dokie. So at this point, let's talk about attaching the controls to the skinned model. But before, actually, maybe I should just double check. Are there any more questions about skinning or hierarchy or making a joint or orienting a joint that we should chat about before I move on to adding the controls to the joints?
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So if you were to kind of like summarize it, essentially if the joints become detached from the hands because of any edits, you can just reskin it and then copy paint weights, and that'll kind of correct the issue. Okay. All right.
I guess the little bit of a fancier method for saving paint weight information is underneath. This is a newer one. It's underneath of the deform menu. You can come down here, and with your mesh selected, you can say export weights, and it exports a specific file called an XML file. This is pretty neat.
Okay.
I'll just go ahead and drop it on my desktop, say hand weights.
So like if you were like, I want to start over, but I want to keep these weights.
Yes, but I will need to mention a couple caveats that are important for if it will work or not. So when I export this, you'll see it looks like an Excel sheet when it kind of looks like an Excel sheet. Where are my hand weights? There we go. So this is what comes out the other end. It's basically a number representation of all the stuff. So it has this shape, which is your combined hand shape, and then it has all the values of where stuff is, and then it also has values for like how much paint information is on each one and from what joint. So it's like really, really accurate. It used to use kind of like texture maps, which is something if you're more familiar with 3D, it would export out basically like a black and white texture map, which was kind of accurate, but also kind of limited because of how that was. Anyway, now that you have that, so this file, what you could do if you haven't changed the makeup of your hand. So what this would work is if you have combined hands and for whatever reason something went wrong and it got detached, you could do that on the combined hands again. But if you have separate hands and you export out the paint weights for like the left hand, you couldn't use that on something that like, you're like, I combined my hands, now I'm going to import these skin weights. It wouldn't work because the mesh doesn't have, or that file doesn't have all the numbers for both sets of hands, if that makes sense. So
that makes sense. And if you had like a mesh that wasn't exactly the same, then it wouldn't work either because the mesh doesn't add up.
Correct. Yeah, the verts would be in different places. They all have very specific names as far as Maya is concerned. That's why the copy skin weights operation is actually pretty darn flexible, because you could have you know, if I had a duplicate mesh of these hands, actually, well, so if I had a duplicate mesh, and this mesh was even different than the original, so this edge ring was gone. So now it actually has a completely different amount of vertices than the original hand. You can still use the copy weights operation because it just looks for the closest verts and it copies that information onto the closest verts, which is really powerful. So I mentioned in the previous lesson, if you have like a bunch of characters that you're having to do skin weights operations on, sometimes it's really nice to just kind of have a really good base character. And then that's your starting place for your paint weights, because you attach genes to your new character. They have like wrinkles and different topology and whatever, but you can just copy over the paint weights from like your neutral character and it will fix a lot of the problems. You might still have to go and tweak little things, but it will get you like 90% of the way there, if that makes sense. Cool. Any last questions before we move on, Taylor?
Yeah, sorry, I have
Yeah.
two things.
Uh-huh.
One, you shared with us like the file of your hands that were rigged that we could look at. When I was looking in that, I couldn't see like where you had your weights or the joints or anything. So I was wondering if you could share a file with us where it showed like the painted weights, because as I was doing mine, I was just like unsure about how much weight should be off of like each joint. I guess not having like a reference to really look at while I'm doing it.
Okay. So I'll ask about the not being able to see the weights in a second. But one thing that is turned off by default in the project is because of how I've got this set up. So in each panel, you can turn off and on different things to see. There's a lot of stuff going on in Maya, and sometimes it's nice to focus on specific parts. So the file that I uploaded, you can actually only see NURBS curves and meshes. I turned off joints just because I didn't want to look at them. But you can turn the visibility of joints back on just by checking that box. Now you can see joints again. They're gigantic, which is not good, but so I'll go ahead and fix that. Cool.
Okay,
So
I was like, that makes more sense that they just weren't visible.
yeah, they're there. They just weren't visible. Exactly. So all the other stuff. So like, I don't know, you can turn off and on all these things. They all have their own specific uses. But for the rigging process, once I get to a certain point, which is like I've finished my skin weights, I tend to leave the joints turned off because of this. Like if I wanted to do a drag select on like these two controls, when I let go, it automatically selects the joints, which is really annoying because the joints are kind of like higher in priority as far as Maya is concerned for selections. So the fastest way or the easiest way I found to make to avoid this is to just turn that off. And now when I do a drag select, it actually selects that stuff. Does that make sense?
Okay, great. Thank you. And then do you think you could quickly just go over like the steps of the process again? I know you kind of started that at the beginning, but then after, like where is painting weights in that, and then where is like
yeah, so the
splines
paint
and
weights
stuff? I
would be
know.
the exact next step. So once
Okay.
you've got your joints correctly set up and oriented, and you've done the freeze transformations trick, this is where you would attach your combined hands to your joints. So, and that's skin. No, we'll do bind the hands to the joints using I always forget the exact name of it. Skin, yeah, just bind skin. Cool, so yeah, that would be the exact next step. Then you pick one like side, one hand to work on. Go ahead to fix and paint all the weights. Once you get that hand working really good, then you could copy all that to the other side. So that's when you would use the mirror skin weights to the other hand. If you were painting the right hand, yeah, so if you're painting the right hand, use negative to positive. If you're using the left, it's the opposite. So that's positive to negative. Do you remember that part of the mirror joint where it was that checkbox? That's something that you can test just by like, if you hit that, if you're not sure or you don't really want to keep that in your brain because you can only, I only have so much info I can keep in my head at one time. So I just hit the mirror weights and I'll just like wiggle one of the fingers, just select one of the joints and see if it's got the good paint weights. If it doesn't, I just undo, go back a step and then redo check the box or uncheck the box and then redo the mirror skin weights. All right, so at this point, once you've gotten here, this is when I would actually start to make all the controls and name all the controls. Make and name all controls. Once you make and name all the controls, I would include positioning as part of this step. Once they're all kind of where they should be, so, I like to have my first pointer control right around my first digit, like the first joint, and so on and so forth. Have the wrist control right on top of the wrist joint.
Why
Once
is
I've got
your
them,
wrist control all wiggly?
what's that?
Why is your wrist control all like squiggly?
So I started with a default just circle, and what I did was kind of like shrunk it to the size I wanted, and then you can right click on the curve and activate the control vertexes, and that'll turn on these little dots. And this is how Maya knows what shape to draw. So you can pull those around and you can change the shape of your circle. So I just kind of adjusted it so that it looked unique, and at a glance I knew what control that was because it looks different than every other control. It tends to be just the way that I do it.
Okay, so that shape isn't doing something different than the other ones. It's just for like the user side.
Just visual reference. Yeah. And anytime you select your control, like any of the controls, you'll see exactly where it's oriented. So even though this little circle is up here, you can see that its pivot point is here. And the reason that its pivot point is there is because I basically did a very similar process, but instead of grabbing just two of those verts, turn off my joints, I grabbed all of them and I moved them up and kind of shrank them down. So now when I go back to the normal, if I click on it, it's still located here, even though it looks like it's up here. Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, so we were at the step where you've made all your controls, you've named them all correctly, and you've put them where they should be so that if you rotated the control, it would rotate the joint at the right pivot point. You want them right on top of each other.
And for this specific project, you want us to make the controls and place the controls via the Mel scripting method, right?
Oh, you don't have to. If you want to do it all by hand because you're like, this Mel script thing is too much to add on to the pile at the beginning. I just want to do it by hand. That's totally fine. If you wanted to come in by hand, designed this, initial control do a freeze transformation. So everything is like that. Pick it up like this, name it, new control, whatever, group it by either using Control G like that once, and then Control G again. So now you have both your groups, and then you come in and rename each of those groups with whatever naming convention you want to use. You don't have to use my naming convention. You could call it KG or MG, like whatever you'll remember. That's totally fine. The last step that you would need to do is make sure that you get really accurate placement of whatever you call your top level group, the Z group. You can use V to do snapping stuff. So go ahead and turn off the mesh so I don't accidentally snap to the wrong thing. This is my new control. You can put it in exactly the right place. If you hold V, you can see the little option thing changes to a little circle. And then if you click the middle point and start to drag around, it'll snap itself to the relevant thing. So say I want to put it on the thumb, and then I want it to rotate into position, do all the right stuff. So yeah, you could do all that by hand by all means. I merely suggested using the tool because that is a lot of steps and you'll have to do it 30 some times. Just a way to save some time.
All right, thank you so much for going over that.
Mm-hmm. Down. Boom. Oh, one other nice little thing that I'll mention. I think it was Derek. I mentioned this to in an email, but so up here, these little icons are the kind of global turning off and on whether or not you can select something. So if you wanted to leave your joints on, you could just turn this off here, and that way you can't select a joint. And you could also do that with a mesh, which is this little square thing. So then you couldn't select a mesh. I'll use these a whole bunch with when I'm animating, because the only thing that I want to be able to grab is controls at that point. So then I'm always, if I'm doing drag select, I'm always grabbing splines. So just a little FYI. Turn those off and on up here. Cool. So once you've got your controls named, placed, this is when you would start to parent them to each other to create the hierarchy that you want. So in the case of the finger controls, the way that you're going to want to parent them is like this. So if you, oh no, did I not save my, upgraded my Maya and I didn't save my control. Does anybody have the Mel script so I don't have to go digging for it from Monday? Today's Wednesday, yeah. And if you do, could you just paste it in the chat?
Yeah, 1 second. I think I do. Oh, someone's got it.
Nice, thank you. All right. All right, so say I have my controls. Yeah, uh-oh. Oh, I've already got, dang it, I've already got stuff named that. All right, let's try it. So Maya is very picky with names. You're not allowed to have duplicate names. So if two things are named the same thing, it won't work. So I can just real quickly hide my original joints. Oop. and use a tool that I've been meaning to mention for 2 class periods now. So underneath of modify, I've got this thing called search and replace names. This can be really nice for fixing or changing large groups of things all at once. So because I have this thing underscore JNT at the end of all of my joints, what I can do is search for that underscore JNT and replace it with something else. I'll call it JNT1. And for Maya, that would mean that that's a different name and everything should work correctly. I've got the option of hierarchy selected. So even though I've only got the root joint selected, it's going to look through everything that's a child and a grandchild and a great grandchild, and it will look for this and replace it with this, which is, as you imagine, if you have 50 joints, that's a lot of work. And with a single button press, you can see that I've added that one into everything. So search and replace is very, very powerful for working through large selections of things. If you've been careful with your naming conventions, it's really, really powerful. So now that I've got my new joints, I should be able to select it and use my tool because it's different. And yep. So, oh, no, it's not. Dang it. Oh, there's something else going wrong under the hood. So the first time through, it should work fine because I've got duplicate joint stuff. It's not being very helpful, but I'll go ahead and power through. There's one control. All right, nice. So we're at this stage. Imagine with the theater of the mind that you have all the controls in place. And now you're at the point when you want to create your hierarchy. So what you would want to do, for example, if I wanted this control to work correctly with this control, I can use direct parenting. And the thing that you want to parent is actually the top level group thing. So this thumb Z group is the thing that you're going to parent underneath of this spline. So in your outliner, what you will see is I can select this top level Z group and then holding Control on Windows or Command on Mac, click the NURB, and then you can parent. Now this thing is underneath of the spline, still with the exact same original formation for this control, but now when I move this, you can see that that control follows. Good? Yes? Thumbs up? Any questions on why it has to be that way? Why can't you just... So if I were to select this control, then select this control and hit parent, why that would be a problem? Can people see why up here in the channel box? Now I've got all these funky transforms and stuff because it's in relation to this now. This is its parent, which is over here. It's no longer has its nice groups, which got left behind because it moved it out of this by doing that selection method. So you want to make sure that you're selecting this high level group first, then the control and hitting parent so that it brings everything along so that the control is still zeroed out because it's still nested in all its sweet K and Z groups.
So would you recommend setting up all your constraints on your controls first and then going through and parenting?
I would actually recommend setting up the parent structure for your controls first so that your controls are behaving how you would expect them. Because the final step of just doing the constraints to the joints, it should be super fast and there's not a lot of thought behind it.
Okay,
But
so you haven't done that on these examples yet.
no, I have not. No.
Okay.
So
okay.
yeah, if you've gone through your whole main structure, so let's say Let's say I made this, crafted this painstakingly by hand, this wrist control. So I would want to select my thumb root Z group, then select the control, hit parent. So now it's underneath, right? And the next thumb Z group is underneath of this. So if I were to move the wrist control, it would move everything. If I were to move or rotate this, it would rotate the child. And if I rotate that, it rotates by itself. So that would be the behavior that I would expect as I'm running through my nerves curves, making sure everything is set up. Once it is set up and it does look good, that's when you can do the final step of, so create parent hierarchy for controls. Then the final step is constrain joints to controls. So this is definitely the final step in this part. I guess the final step would be making macros, which is what we'll cover today. So yeah, once you have your controls functioning correctly, you could select your control first, holding shift, hold your joint second. I would recommend just using parent constraints for all of them. It's nice and simple. Oops. Make sure that the option of maintain offset is turned on, so the joint stays put when you add the constraint. Apply. So now when you move the wrist, joints come along. But you can see I haven't put any constraints on this yet, so the joints aren't moving. Select control first, joint second, hit apply. Rotate that. Rotate that. So I move the top level thing, goes like that. Everything should function. And test as you go along if something's not vibing or they got the wrong selection order and you accidentally constrained the joint to the control instead of or you accidentally constrain the control to the joint instead of the joint to control. You can just undo it and reverse and fix it at that point. Oh, the one hotkey that I used, G by itself. If you just hit G, it'll redo whatever the last operation that you did. So if you move a sphere and then you hit G, making a sphere was the last thing. If you, I don't know, so like with my constraint, what I did was I selected this, I hit made parent constraint. I'll go ahead and delete it. Apply. So now parent constraint is the last thing that I did. So I could just select this, select the joint and hit G, and it would do a parent constraint again. So you don't have to go into your menu or leave this open or anything. So G is a nice hotkey for doing lots of stuff. Nice. And I know I'm going quickly. I apologize. It's a lot of material, but please, if things aren't clear, keep asking questions because I'm just going to assume that everybody's good until somebody says, hey, wait a minute. So with that being said, should I go ahead and move on to the macro stuff, the set-driven key stuff?
I have a quick question. It's not really related to what Ace was talking about, but I guess as I'm working with stuff, I'm sort of getting tired of seeing my transform display. How do I turn that off?
Your transform display?
Yeah, the X, Y, Z things that are popping out of my like little joints.
Oh, yeah, that should just be under, you just redo the thing that you did to bring it up. So So transform
I
display,
did that.
you just click it again and it'll turn off.
Did that, but it's not doing it.
Make sure that all your joints are selected.
Yeah, I also did that.
Oh,
Weird.
okay. We can, that is weird.
I had to like individually turn some of them on for some reason. They're all like in their hierarchy, but
So if you
like,
selected one that definitely has it on and you went through the transform display and then local rotation axes, it doesn't turn it off?
so like I just selected everything again, and then I even like opened up the hierarchy a little bit to like see the like fingers or whatever. And it turned off my wrist and my arm, but like my other my fingers are still turned on.
Yeah,
right?
so they actively have to be selected.
Right. But so they were all selected, and when I turned them on before, I had to go through each little like joint that I had and turn them all on individually. So I had to do it, I guess, like a dozen times to turn everything on individually.
Yeah. One quick way of selecting an entire hierarchy, if you select the root joint and then you right click on it, you can come down here and say select hierarchy. And then if you hover over your outliner and you hit F, it'll focus on whatever is selected. So you can see that it's selected every single thing in the joint hierarchy by doing that.
Okay, now it's turning some on and some off. I'll just keep at it.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Where would you expect us to be with this project on Monday? And then also, is this due before class on Wednesday, or are we gonna have time on Wednesday to work also?
I was
Next
hoping,
Wednesday.
yeah, I was hoping that Wednesday could be when we look at the animations that you made using the rig. But if most people aren't at that stage, it wouldn't be good to have a critique with only a couple people. So we could do one more day and look at stuff on Monday. I guess that's a good point. Somebody was asking about like due dates and when things are like, you know, when do I expect things to be turned in and stuff like that. In general, like I try and shoot for a constrained time period to work on stuff, but oftentimes it'll change based on people's comfort level or how successful they are with getting stuff done. So sometimes the next project wouldn't start on the exact right day, and that would push the due date for that project forward a little bit. So I try to block things out with how much time I'm allotting starting out. So for this one, it was just going to be a 2-week project. If we need 2 weeks in a day, then we can do stuff on Monday. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And just like I feel like I work better with just planning things out by days. So by Monday, like where do you think we should be in the process?
I would hope that you would be around this where you have controls on your rig that you're able to animate. That would be Monday.
Okay, thank you.
Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, if there are other quick questions, speak now, or I will launch into some more fire hose of information.
Kirby, I have a question. At what point do you freeze the transformations as you're working? Do you do it every time you move like a joint into position or a control?
So I guess the answer to that is it depends. The freeze transformations on joints, you should do whenever you have your joint pointing to the next one. So if you've manually rotated stuff or unparented and parented, once you've got it set up so that you're like, all right, the joint is good. This would be how I would want it to be when I bind it to my mesh. That's when you would freeze transformations on the joint. as far as an object or a control is concerned. You can use freeze transformations. Like I'll just randomly, or not randomly, I'll click it at specific times. So if I've by hand made a control, which started with me just making a default circle, and I'm like, this is way too big of a control to use, I might just use the scale tool to go like that. And then I'm like, also I want it facing this way. So I'm like, this is how I would want my control to be when it's 0. This is when I would hit freeze transformations. So right there, when I hit it, now everything is 0 and all the scales are 1. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So one thing to keep in mind that's important about the controls is if you were to move stuff, like at this point, so I'm like, this is how I want my control, and you shift it into place here, and then you hit freeze transformations like that. Now, as far as this control is concerned, this is now the 0 point in the world, which may not vibe with other things. So that's why I recommend making sure that you have your controls in those groups to move them around, because if your pivot point, if your reference point is over here, that's going to kind of mess with the reference points of other things if their pivot point isn't here as well. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of one of the harder things to like that I think that'll click the more that you make these controls and the more that you position them. But just to start, the rule of thumb, I would say it wouldn't be done correctly if you don't have, if you're moving this control by hand like this, wouldn't do that. I would make sure that it's in a group or in 2 groups in a Z group, and you're moving the Z group to get it in place. You're not moving the NURBS curve. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So that would be the workflow I recommend. When positioning controls, don't ever position the curve, position the group that's like the curve is inside of.
Okay.
And then you don't have to freeze transformations because it's fine if that high level group has funny numbers on it.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So we're at 11:34. I'm hoping that we can get through the set-driven key thing reasonably quickly, maybe 20 minutes or so. And then I can jump into individual projects to look at any questions or concerns that people have. So while I'm doing this demo, make sure that if you do have a question about your specific project, just put it in your project folder, and that way I can, jump in and open it up really easily. Cool. So a set-driven key. So a set-driven key is basically a way of activating an attribute on multiple things from a single point. So for example, if I had, if I had 3 spheres here and I wanted to have something that moves all of these up like this all at the same time, what I could do is manually select all 3 of them and then move them up, or I could have a control over here that has some kind of special attribute, or like I could link it even to one of the rotations or translates existing on the control right now. For this case, what we're going to do is make a new attribute and then link properties to that new attribute. So on this control, you can go with it selected, you go up to edit and say add attribute, and then you can add whatever you want and it will show up over here in the channel box. So I'll call this test up, control. And from last time I mentioned, don't really use spaces when naming stuff. Always use underscores because when Maya looks through stuff, if there's a space, I don't know that it respects the space. It will make things difficult. For our first attribute, we're just going to leave it as a float, which means it's you can be less than 1. So 0.1 is an acceptable float. If you did an integer, then it could only be whole numbers. So it could only be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's less fine grained. So float has, tons of fine grained control between 0 and 10. So the minimum value of this float I'm going to make is 0, and the maximum is 10. And then when I add it, you can see it appears over here in my channel box. And hiding and locking controls, just a quick review. If you highlight stuff, you can right click on it and say lock and hide, and it will get rid of everything, or it doesn't get rid of it, it hides it and it logs it. If you ever need to get it back, you can come up to edit, channel control, and it will bring up everything that's possible that you could ever put over here. The default things are translate, rotate, and scale. So if you ever need to get any of those back, you can just scroll down to where it says it. So translate X, Y, and Z, and you can move it back here, and you can see that it's still locked. So I'll just shift it back into hidden. Cool. So I do spend quite a bit of time when I make controls or custom controls, making sure that the only things that are visible and keyable. So that's the other thing that it does. If you lock it, that means that you can't animate it. So, which is nice if you don't want to accidentally put translates on a control that you don't want translates on. So if you lock that, then you don't ever worry or have to worry about accidentally putting animation that you didn't want on something. So I would recommend locking and hiding any attribute that you're not going to be animating. So for this instance, I'm only going to be having my test control here. So with it selected, I'm going to turn on my set driven key editor, which is underneath of edit, set driven key. That brings up this menu. So the top thing is the driver and the bottom things are the driven. So with this selected, if I hit load driver, and that means that it's going to put any attribute that's keyable over here. So test up control is the only attribute that I can use. So that's why it's there. And then if I select all 3 of these at once, you can actually say load driven. And then you can select all 3 of these and pick something on them that you want this thing to affect. So what I want to do is affect the vertical position of all 3 of those spheres all at the same time. So if I select all 3 spheres and then translate Y, what I do when I hit, or what happens when I hit key, is it means anytime that this control is at 0, these spheres will be at Y position, whatever they are currently, which is 0. You can see this little blue tick mark. If I select each one of the spheres, indicates that there's a set driven key now on that translate value. So if I wanted to add in a new point along my set driven key scheme, what I would want to do is pick some value for my control. So if I make my test up control 5 and I hit enter, now what I can do is position these things in some way. So I'll put this one like that, this one like that, this one like that. And now if I hit key, it'll say when this value is at 5, these things go there. So if I scrub that back and forth, you can see that it's like popping back and forth. Okay, sorry. One other thing that you need to make sure, this is kind of getting into territory that I wasn't thinking we would want to cover for a little bit. So please hold while I fix one of the settings so that I get the behavior that I want. So when you guys are setting up your set-driven keys, it's going to behave correctly. I had some custom stuff because I was doing some animation the other day. So don't worry about all this stuff. Okay, cool. So starting from the beginning, select the control, make sure it's at 0, select these 3 spheres. I've added them into my driven. I've selected those spheres in an attribute that I want to control, and I hit key. Now that blue tick reappears. Go ahead and select my control again, make it 5. Now position these things in some way. Hit key again. And now when I scrub that back and forth, you can see it's going from it's 0, like whatever the control, wherever these were when the control was at 0, it's there. And when I go to 5, it does some value in between that. So if it's at 3 or 2.5, it's halfway between where it needs to be and 5. So you can add in as many of these targets as you want on your control. So if I come in here to 10, I could add in a new position for these things, which maybe is putting this one down and this one up and this one down. And I hit key. So now it goes to 5. And then once it hits 5, it starts to go to its 10 value, and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit arbitrary at this point, but what you can do from here is hopefully see how you can leverage the control group structure that we've talked about to add in this functionality of maybe some hand positions. So let's say I wanted to curl. Maybe I want to turn curl actually into making a fist. So what I'll do is add in the thumb control to this shape as well, because at the moment, if I select my control, say load driver, curl fingers, the only thing that's currently part of this is, you can see the ring K group, the pointer K group, or sorry, the middle, the pointer, the ring, and the pinky. So you can see that on the rotate Z is currently what's active. So when I manipulate this curl control, what it's doing is driving the Z value of my K group back and forth for each one of these controls. So the pointer 1, pointer 2, and pointer 3 all have their own K groups. And all 3 of those K groups, Z rotation is being controlled by this single thing. So what I want to do is now go add in the K group for thumb 1, thumb 2, and thumb 3. So to do that, what I would do is come to thumb group 1, unzip. Okay, cool. So now my entire thumb is visible. So what I want is the K group for the end thing, K group for that one, and also the K group for that one. And how I'm selecting without hitting the in-between ones is I'm using control to select. On Mac, it would be command. So if I've started with this, I hold control and I can select another one. If I were to use shift, it would grab all the stuff in between, which is not what I want. I only want specific ones. So this one, and this one. Now with those active, what I can do is come over here and click my driven button. Now my K groups show up here. And what I want to do is control the rotate value. So at the moment, I've actually got it activated. So this isn't where I want to start. I want to make sure that I start at 0, like that. So if I hit key, that's where my rotations will start. And you can check to make sure that you've added in the key by selecting one of your K groups. And indeed, it put that blue tick mark, so that indicates that my sit-driven key has been correctly added. So I'll dial my curl fingers all the way up. So this would be when the thumb would be wrapping around and hopefully making a fist. So come in here to my thumb 1K group, make sure that I'm only rotating the Z value. So just a little bit. And the 2, rotate that a little bit. Rotate 3, rotate that a little bit. So here you can see a good example of taking some time at the beginning and doing some planning on your rotations, really paying off in the end. So I only had to rotate along one axis to get that thumb to kind of curl where a thumb would naturally curl. If I didn't spend time kind of tilting and angling the joints to be in the right line, if I just left them vertical, then I would have to use all 3 of these channels to actually get it into the right place, which limits the amount of control I can do. What if I wanted to control the up and down of the thumb as for a different thing? I wouldn't have that ability because I've already used all 3 of the channels for my sit-driven stuff. You know, just a side note. So now that I've rotated my K groups, I hit key once again. So now if I scrub this back and forth, you can see it's making a fist with a single control. I'll close that. And please ask questions because this is a weird, it's kind of weird to think about one thing doing lots of things. What part of this process isn't making sense at the moment? Or is it completely making sense because I nailed it? Cool. Going once, going twice. All right. I would say the area where I struggled when I first started doing this, and I see a lot of errors when people first start using sit-driven keys, is the order of when you hit key and when you're moving things and when you're dialing up and down your attribute. So the process that you want to always use is set the control attribute first. So that means you want the control attribute is one of these. So curl fingers is my current control attribute. So this is the thing that you would want to set the value first. So you're like, at 0, this is what I want to happen. Or at 10, this is what I want to happen. So that's the first thing that you set. And then the second thing that you do is move or rotate the driven objects into place. So this, once you've set this to 10, that's when you go into your K group or your control or whatever the set driven key is affecting, and you put it in whatever value you want. So this is when you manipulate these things, right? Once everything is in place, that's when you press key. So with this thing open and you've rotated this, that's when you would hit key. The reason that key isn't currently active right now is what you have to do is make sure that you have something selected in your driver so that whatever your driving attribute is, make sure that it's selected. And then make sure, actually, maybe I'll just add this into the steps. How about that? So select the driving attribute in the set driven key menu, and then select the driven So in here, if you're driving multiple things, you can hold control and select lots of things. You can just select one thing. If you have multiple objects, oops, if you have multiple controls over here, you can select multiple controls all at the same time And if you clicked an attribute, that would be the attribute for all of these, right? So once you have your attribute selected, you have your driven attribute selected, that's when you press the key. The thing that I will see a lot is people will put the thing into position. They're like, I'm going to position the thing that I want first, and then they'll go to the thing and they'll adjust this. And that'll be very frustrating because it will. So watch this. Oh, actually. So say I've made the position, this is the position that I want, and then I come up and I'm gonna like dial it, it'll pop because it's automatically going to whatever the set driven key is. So that's why you have to put your attribute, your driver attribute first, because you do, the moment you move that, it's going to immediately try and do its set driven key magic. So that might not be clear right now, but if you ever do it in the backwards order, you're like, why does it keep ruining the pose that I set it up in? The reason is because it's doing its job. It's putting it in the set driven key that it needs to go to. So you have to set the attribute driver first, then you position. Cool. Let's see where we're at. So we're at 11:52, and I will say that that's actually pretty, I think that pretty well covers everything that we will need for this animation. We've got the idea of our joints. I've got the idea of skinning. We've covered the idea of skin weights and adjusting the skin weights. We've covered the idea of making control, making sure that that control is structured in a way that you can place it in the world without kind of polluting its nice zero values, making sure that that control can stay zeroed out as you put it in place. We covered how to parent those controls in the hierarchy so that they'll follow the right thing. We covered how to attach a joint to a control using a constraint. And in this last section, we just covered doing the macros, which is set-driven keys. So with this process, you should be able to, if you complete all of this, you should be able to get to the point now where you can storyboard out a little hand animation and have the hands do some stuff and animate, because you can put keyframes on your controls and that will create animation. Cool. So at this point, I will now ask if anybody has specific questions about their file. They're seeing something weird. Somebody said that paint weights are going down to a 0 point and there's a nexus in the universe. So that's one. Okay, Megan, is your file in the Google Drive?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see what we can see. File open. Oh, one thing you can do, if there's a place that you often go to grab files and it doesn't automatically show up over here on like your nice, easily selectable thing, Google Drive is one that you can add over here just by going to your computer. It'll show up at the high level. You can just click and drag that over into here and it will kind of add it as an option every time. So now you don't have to do that extra process. You can just click on My Drive. Class resources, 2021. And
Okay, so I don't have a lot, but basically it's in the index finger.
okay.
So like that's the only thing I've done. So like that's fine. But then as you move up the finger, it just gets
Okay. Yeah, it looks like Maybe, no, okay, so this one is oriented a little strangely. So is that the behavior you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So let's duplicate both of these. And I will hide. Put these in so it's easy to hide. Okay, so this is my duplicate stuff. The first thing I notice is that this joint is kind of pointed in a unique direction compared to the other joints. Even the end joint, I would make sure is kind of, you could think of making sure that it's going off into the direction that you would want it to go.
Okay.
So the rotation of this final digit still needs to be similar to all the other ones. So the first thing, let's make sure that this is just kind of free. Unlock that. Make sure to delete history. And since this is the joint on the end, I can just kind of rotate it manually without worrying about affecting all the children. If I were wanting to fix the rotation on this joint, I would probably use either orient joints or need to unparent all the children and then rotate it and then do stuff.
Okay.
But for this one, we'll just see how it goes with this. One visualization mode that I'll use sometimes to help position stuff is this option, which turns on the little wire mesh over top of the kind of gray stuff. And that lets me use this little indicator to see if it's in the right place. So you can bump up and down the size of your manipulator by hitting plus and minus like that. And so now I can kind of use that red indicator where I'm trying to get it is to maybe poke out right here, right at the end of the finger. Make sure that it's flat. A little more. Yeah, actually, maybe I'll have it poke out at this point. Yeah, that seems pretty flat. It's pointing up vertically. You can see it's kind of coming through this vert, or this vert would be what I would try to aim at for where this joint kind of is oriented vertically. So it's nice and flat. So once I have that, this is when I would hit freeze transformations, because right now these orients or these rotations are all jacked up. So if I hit that, now it's 0. So it rotates nicely just up and down like that. The reason you want that is it's nice to be able to select all 3 joints like that. Then you can hit the rotate, and even only rotating a lot. Oh, it looks like, yeah, this one needs. Okay, cool. So that one, here's one that you can probably fix using the orient joint tool instead of the kind of manual process.
Okay.
So you can come in here to skeleton, go to orient joint, and I'll go ahead and uncheck orient the children because I'm just going to work on one joint at a time here. I don't know, maybe this one I've already worked on, but this is just an option for a different workflow. So the primary axis I'm going to use is X, so I'm going to point with the red line. And the secondary axis, world orientation, I'm going to use Y and positive so that the green arrow points up. That's what that translates to.
Okay.
So if I hit apply, oh, okay. There's non-zero rotations. So the first thing that I'll need to do is just go ahead and freeze transformations on that. So now it's at 0. Now I can hit apply and it'll point at the next joint. So that's the trick, I guess, with the orient joint tool that I forgot to mention. You have to have things set to 0 in order for the orient joint to point at the next joint. So because this stuff wasn't at 0 because I had like it's just not 0. If I hit apply, it won't let me fix that. It won't point at the other joint. But if I hit 0, or if I hit freeze transformations, it switches everything to 0. And you can hit apply. Now it's like that. Now it points the right way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So now this one is oriented correctly. That one looks good, and it's set to 0, so that's great. And so what I was saying of why you want them all kind of pointing at each other, and also have all the Y's pointing the same way, is you can come in and just rotate along a single axis, and it should curl like nicely. It won't curl kind of off to the side or anything, just goes right in line.
Okay.
Cool. So I'd recommend going through each one of your joints, making sure that they're all, so this would be another one you could fix probably just with manual, put in place, freeze transformations. Now you're good to go.
Okay.
Once you've gone through that, you can select your mesh, select your joint, do the skin, then come into your original right hand, which I believe that's, yeah, so your original right hand. First, hold Control or Command, then select your second right hand and say skin, copy skin weights. So all the work that you did on your other hand should translate over to here, right?
Okay.
Yep. So now if I rotate this, it's still doing weird deflating, and I'm guessing that's because there's influence on the end of this finger from another joint. So if I come in here and I look at the influence, you can see how this isn't bright white. That means that other things are influencing this. I would expect the visualization of the end of the finger to basically be completely white in like the nail region and this whole fingertip. So if I come in here to actually just keep it on replace, make this brush the right size so it doesn't accidentally grab other stuff. And I start to add in the weight. It's going to be too much of a rotation to work on. So I'll unrotate it a little bit so it's a little easier to work on. Cool. So now I see how the end of the finger is bright white.
Yeah.
So that means that this joint is influencing all these verts at the end at a value of 1, which is 100%. So it's 100% influencing all of those verts. So now when I rotate this joint, it moves the finger correctly.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Cool. Well, I'll go fix it.
Yeah, and painting with that brush, like you saw, I was kind of brushing on influence. So that's when I'm describing the method of doing paint weights. This is paint mode. So you're painting skin weights.
Yeah.
So the other one that I discussed was select mode. So oftentimes I use select mode in the fingers just because it's really fast to double click one of these edge rings. And it'll grab, like, the way that these hands are made is in this method because it helps with this process. So you can select in paint weights, go to select mode and then go to edge. You can double click these edges. So like all of these, I actually want to basically be 100% on this joint, right? Because this is the next joint that I want to fix. I'm going to make sure that this section of the finger is only influenced by this joint. So at this point, there's no black and white like visualization, so it's a little tricky to know what's going on. but you can kind of trust that if you dial this value up, that would basically make all the verts attached to those rings, whatever value is in here. And it's easy to see that happen if you just do a little baby rotation in here like that, so that you can see that there's a change. Go here, select mode, edge, select all the edges that I want to use. Yeah, that should be good. Select my joint last. And then when you dial that up, see how they're all shifting?
Okay.
So once you get it to 1, you know that that's basically 100% only on this joint. And you can just kind of walk through all the edge rings that way. So here is this middle one. I'll also actually add it to this joint because I'm going to say that this edge ring is influenced by this joint. Slide that up. And this will be where I'll say this is my transition between this joint and the next one. So the first thing that I would do is select that joint, put 100% influence on that. And then holding control is actually how you deselect. So you can deselect that joint, and then hold shift and click that joint. And you can manually type 0.5. So what that means is that the verts on this edge ring are 50% influenced by this thing and 50% influenced by that thing. And that's way faster and way more discrete than hand painting. You're like, I'm increasing it by 0.05 each time I barely touch it with stuff. So this is like a way of knowing for sure these verts are 50% here and 50% here. So now if you come in and you start to kind of rotate these joints, you can see the influences, like the movement, the way it moves. This edge ring stays put because it's on this one. This edge ring moves somewhat, and this one basically follows it exactly. It's kind of the movement that you're looking for.
Okay.
So when you rotate your edge ring, that's what you should see. This one on the end is following it 100%. There's no deviation from the movement in the joint and the ring. This edge ring is 50-50, so you can see it's kind of mushy. And then this one on the end doesn't move at all. So that's a really good place to start for your paint weights. Or, I mean, you can kind of leave it there. You'll get some decent deformation. Your fingers won't look weird if you just did that formula. And that's often to, I think Derek was talking about wanting to learn about topology and proper edge flow. That's a good starting point for a lot of when you're drawing out your polygons or you're making your polygons. Where you want something to bend, it's usually good to have a edge ring right in the middle. So like one right in the middle, and then you'll put ones reasonably close on the outside. So like one's there and there. Because what will happen is this middle edge ring, you'll have a 50-50 influence. And then on the outside edge ring, you'll put it 100% on the previous joint. And then this edge ring will be 100% on the other joint. So it's a way of kind of making it so that it doesn't do a pipe cleaner effect or a straw effect where it like totally folds, which is very bad.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Cool. This is 0 dot. If, as you're painting weights and you've like accidentally done some stuff, and also you didn't zero your rotations before doing things, there is a way of putting it back to whatever the pose is that you attached it underneath of bind and say go to pose or go to bind pose. If you click that, it'll put it in whatever the pose was when you first did when you first attached it, which is nice. So sometimes that is very, very useful. Okay, so that do you understand why it was mushing and being weird at the end of the finger now? It kind of looked like it was deflating.
It's because my rotation was off, right? And like
it more to do with the skin weights.
oh, okay.
So here, I bet this finger will be similar. Let's do, oops. Yeah, so see how there's kind of light gray on this side and gray on this side?
Mm-hmm.
That means that I'm going to guess there's influence. Yeah, see how this joint has influence on this finger?
Mm-hmm.
That's why when you rotate this right now, it's pulling that other finger.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to make sure that you isolate all influence for each one of these joints to only the finger they're on.
Okay.
So that's why it was doing that weird deformation, because there was influence on these verts on the end from some other joint. I don't know.
Okay.
I didn't click through to find out what it was, but some other joint was influencing it. You didn't want that.
Okay. Okay. I have to fix that.
Cool. All right. Next up, who's got a specific Maya file question? Anybody? Anybody? Okay, well, that's good.
Well, Kirby, I guess the question I had was about the hierarchies.
Uh-huh.
I guess the first more general question is with the K groups and Z groups. I guess what is specifically the, I guess, reasoning for them? Because I found as I was working some last night is that like I had forgotten to put a couple of the joints or a couple of the controls in a group, and so it was messing everything up. And so I was wondering kind of like how that worked and why they needed to be in two groups.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. That is it's a little bit of a tricky thing to figure out. So since this is a nice fresh file, let's work on these joints that we've got oriented correctly. Come in here to this and looks like this got modified in some way. Okay, well, I'll just do it from scratch. All right, so the reason that you would want to have the multiple groups, so the reasoning for the Z group, I guess we'll start with that. So if we've made a control, we've got it kind of scaled in some way that we want it. Maybe it's just going to be a control that goes around the joint itself. So I'll go ahead and hide that and freeze transformations here. So this is the starting point. Looking at our joint, we know that the X is forward. So when we're looking at our control here, we would want to make sure that this is rotated so that if we were to put this, the red arrow is kind of pointing in a way that's going to be correct. Does that first make sense? We want the base orientation or the base visualization of this control to match whatever the orientation of our joint is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So then the reason that you want to put it inside of a Z group, inside of a group that you use to zero out all the rotations, is here I've got everything nice and set to like no values. Go ahead and delete history. If I were to position this on top of, exactly on top of this joint, I'll do my constraint trick where you just use a temporary one. So maintain offset, turn it off, hit apply, it'll snap it right in place. And then you can just delete your constraint. So you can see that now the rotation is this and the position is that. So if you were to use this for animation, it would probably be hard to know when you're back to zero, when you're back to default, because unless you basically, the way that you could get around it would be to maybe make a keyframe and then never change that keyframe. Make this like your starting keyframe. So at any point, if you had animated this control over like this, and you needed to get back to default, you could go back to here, copy it, and then paste it. So now you know you're back to 0. But it would be pretty hard to remember 6 values that have this random stuff. So that's why I recommend instead to move your control into place on top of your joint. You actually have a group which is now around this control. So now this control is in reference to wherever this group is. So if I move this group, it's still going to maintain the 0 stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so now what you would want to do is use this group, the Z group, select your joint, select your group, apply. So now the Z group has all this random stuff on it, or not random, it has all the values that it needs to get it in exactly the right place. This is still at 0. So it's much easier for animation.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the reasoning for the Z group. The reasoning for the K group, as I call it, keyframe group, you could call it something else, maybe set driven key or M group, macro group, would be that if I, well, actually, before I add that, so if I put a set driven key on this thing, and so I wanted to be able to, with some other control, so let's say this is the wrist, I've added in a curl, right? 0, 10, and that. Bring up the set driven key stuff. Okay, cool. So I'll select this control, add it to driven. Select this control, add it to driver. Select my curl, and I'm going to drive the Z rotation. So it will spin like that when I dial up and down my new attribute that I've added here called curl. So that's the rotate Z. So I've selected my driver attribute. I've selected my driven attribute. I've got my driver attribute set to the right value. So if I hit key, now you can see that this thing has this little blue driver on it. What that means is I can no longer hand key this channel. It's controlled by a set driven key now. So if I try to rotate it, and at any time I do this, it kind of ruins it. It makes it really hard to add in additional layers of information. And actually, I think it'll turn green or it'll get upset. Yeah, so those red ticks indicate that it has a keyframe on it. And this blue tick means that it didn't really accept that keyframe animation. So in order to get this kind of layered effect of being able to have a fist be separate from individually placing just a finger animation, you need to have the container object, the K group, actually be the thing with the set driven keys on it. So that frees up this channel. So now this channel doesn't have that on there. K group is right around the finger control. So the K group is actually the thing that I would want to add all my macros on so that I maintain the ability to do custom keyframe animation on the control. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of the reasoning behind the double group structure. And in general, I mean, so if you were to be very deliberate with making each one of the controls, you may not need the K group in like 90% of your controls because you're not adding macros on 90% of your stuff. But in the instance that you do need it, or you didn't know you need it and later you found out you do, it's much easier to just have it there because it doesn't affect anything. It doesn't hurt anything to have it there. So that's why I'd recommend when you make controls, just go ahead and add in the double group structure, because you for sure are going to have to position the group. So you're going to need the Z group like 95% of the time, 99% of the time. But the K group, it's just good practice to have it in there in case you need it.
Okay. That makes sense.
But yeah, I mean, if you wanted to, especially because we know the parameters of this assignment, in theory, you could just have straight up NURBS curves and have them, you know, directly parent constrained to this thing, and then, you know, make your animation, and I guess be pretty successful making your animation. You wouldn't get the checkbox for on the assignment making a macro as part of the assignment, but you could accomplish an animation without all of this complicated fanciness, or I guess it's good practices. But in the future, when we're making more complicated rigs, you're going to be doing it the complicated way.
I have one more question. One problem I was coming across is I was selecting on the controller circle in the viewport, but that does not select the K group. Is there a way to select the K group just in the viewport and not in the outliner?
Kind of. You can use the up and down keys. So if you select any object, if you press up, it'll walk up in your hierarchy. So that would be a way of doing it without opening up your outliner. And you can always just pay attention to what's over here to make sure that you're on the right thing. So if your group has a specific name that you know, and you select your control and you press up, you can just double check that you are on the right thing, because it should show up here as K group.
Okay.
Cool. Other files, other specific questions, please ask. All right, well, in that case, we have some time at the end of class to just work on the assignment, which is great. I try to shoot for that so you guys don't have to burn into other time that may be needed for other classes. So please use the remainder, the 25 minutes left in this class, to pick some paint weights, add in some joints, start to build out your controls, get your controls parent hierarchy set up, all that good stuff. If there are any questions or things are kind of behaving badly or being weird, please drop them in the Google Drive folder and just shoot me a note and be like, you know, brief description of the weirdness, and be like, hey, can you take a look? And it's often easier for me to debug stuff based on looking in the scene versus a description. I've been getting pretty good at, you know, knowing what description would lead to what problem, but sometimes it's a little tricky. Well, cool. On that note, I will awkwardly start to fade into the background and wish you guys a good rest of the day. And who was it that asked where we should be? Is it Taylor asked where we should be by Monday? Is that right? Can't remember. Anyway, where we should be. Okay, where we should be by Monday is hopefully at the point where your controls and everything are moving your hands. So if you wanted to start to put keyframes on your controls, which would lead to animation, you could do that. If you want bonus points, go ahead and storyboard out whatever you want your little hand animation to be. I was thinking a funny one would be like some sleight of hand from first person. So you go like this, and then he like snaps and a coin appears in one hand, something like that. So something goofy. It doesn't have to be long or complicated. It could just be like a thumbs up and, you know, radical, or the hands are doing different stuff, whatever. Just that would be some bonus points. Sketch out a few ideas for your hands to do so that you can start to block out your animation. Cool.
I guess could
Marietta.
I have you look at mine? But I mean, everybody else can go. Yeah,
Sure,
mine's
I
kind of
can.
weird. But yeah, I don't want to hold anybody else up if everybody wants to go.
No, that's not a problem at all. And people are welcome to hang out or peace out at this point. It's totally up to them. I haven't stopped recording, so I'll keep recording in case there's any gems that pop out of this.
So I wanted to make my hand like kind of running like the thing. Is it called it or thing?
Oh yeah,
Addams
the
Family?
little Addams Family.
Yeah, so I sculpted my own hand because I've never done it before, and I wanted to see how that was like. And it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be, and I thought it was gonna be pretty hard.
Yeah, hands
so my hands looking a little wonky.
hands
And I
are
had it
no
set
joke,
up-
man. Hands are no joke.
Yeah, so I had it set up like this, and I got the weight okay, and then I like totally like did what I needed, like squash, shit to get it to where I needed to be, like
Okay.
this. And I think I've broken some stuff. I think my main issue is that from the wrist joint here, I wanted to add another one here because I wanted this to sort of be like a tail. But this one isn't showing up in my weight options.
Okay. Yeah, I think that
joint
may
is
be
all-
the add influence trick might help with that. We'll see.
It might just be easier for me to just give up on my hand and go to yours.
If it's in here, it should be pretty seamless.
I just mean like, because it's just so wonky right now.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So like, it was looking pretty good.
Oh yeah.
And then yeah.
I don't think that's too wonky. I think that you've just got some paint. I think some paint weights. Is this set to smooth? So you've got turbo smooth on.
Yeah, and then I went into Maya and used its sculpting tools, not ZBrush's sculpting tools, to like move down. I was looking at my hand and like my thumb isn't like this if I'm like putting weight on it, so I like shoved it in there, shoved these down.
Interesting. Okay. So you've got okay. So after you attached it, you went in and did some additional sculpting after it was already weighted. Is that right?
After it was weighted, I moved just like I took mainly X on all the fingers. I didn't mess with Y or Z very much because I didn't want to add too much weirdness to it because I've never done this. So yeah, I just messed with the X and I guess made them all sort of at a 75-degree angle. And then went into the sculpting tools, and then I started weighing stuff down depending on like how my hand was looking.
Interesting. Okay, so in general, where you want to have your object when you're linking and beginning your painting is in a neutral position. It
was in a neutral position.
So if I go
I don't know what's gonna happen anymore.
Okay, so that's its bind pose.
If you like remove the wrist joints, I guess you'll see, if you just like delete them, you'll see that it goes back into like a normal thing, I guess.
Let me reopen this real quick. Okay. And interesting.
That's so yeah.
Okay, so you've got
that's like the tail, if that makes any sense.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so this
that was
actually
the lead thing.
This is actually the root here.
Yeah, but that was the lead thing, and then I realized like that should be the secondary motion after the fact.
I think that's the right decision for this rig. So yeah. Okay, so I got that. And you were saying that these wouldn't turn off if you went to
no, I mean if you delete it, you'll see that like it goes back to like a normal area.
Okay. Oh dear. Okay. Well, anyway. So select hierarchy, and then I don't want that. Okay. Display. I'll leave that one on.
All right.
Okay. Yes. So one thing I will do real quick, just so I can get back here, is the trick that I just mentioned, which is putting a key on this, because it seems like this is an important pose for you right now. Or there we go. All right. So if in the future I need to get back there, I can get back there. Scan. Go to bind pose. So this is the pose that Maya has in memory as its default. Okay.
It's pretty close.
Okay. Cool.
I mean, the arm was at a 90-degree angle, not at a 90-degree angle. It was, flat.
Oh, okay. So I guess that's the first kind of variation between what would be in your head and what is in Maya. So Maya says this is how it's positioned for binding. If
Right.
you thought it was flat, then.
Well, that's how I sculpted it, and then I imported it.
Okay, but the joints,
Yeah.
when you laid them out, were like this to begin with, right?
No, I joined them straight, and then I broke the wrist.
And then you broke the wrist. Okay.
Yeah.
So somehow the bind pose has been shifted to this. So it thinks this is the neutral position,
Okay.
which I would say, if it doesn't vary much past that, might be the right choice. Because like, if in general it's running around and it's mostly like that, the default position in general, my rule of thumb is just basically whatever position the thing is in the most. So if it is normally like, I wouldn't have the fingers like this. I would have them flat because that's going to be way easier for rigging. And I guess the thumb kind of in a more comfortable versus up like that, because that's going to kind of mess with the topology and stuff of a relaxed thumb pad. So that's why the hand that I have is kind of in this position. That's been arrived at after many iterations of making many hands. Fingers being straight, not splayed, fingers being not curled instead of like that. It makes it easier for laying the joints out, especially, but also attaching controls and that kind of thing. It's way easier if it's just straight fingers kind of in a line, and then the thumb kind of all in a single angle, and the thumb joint is also straight. It's not curled like that, if that makes sense. Cool. The second note is, so you've done some sculpting after the fact of like, you know,
after I got into like,
that can sometimes backfire, and I think in this case maybe it backfired a little bit, because when your hand is like at rest, you probably don't want it to have this stuff going on. We're going to cover later something called a corrective shape or a corrective blend shape. And that will get used in areas where it's hard to get the right type of shape with just a joint. So you may have noticed when you bent the finger like that, it did some kind of collapsing or weird thing. And no matter what you did with the paint weights, you weren't getting the shape that you wanted. What you can do in that case is get
with
it.
My opacity turned down, I was able to make it like a little bulging.
Yeah, like and you can get pretty close. Like I would say in general, the fingers you can get pretty darn close. But if you really wanted the case where, so for example, where it like this is like squishing, and the mesh isn't penetrating interpenetration, like they're not cutting through each other and stuff like that. Right. Sometimes that can be really tricky with just a joint. So you would use even another deformer on top of this one called a blend shape. And what you can do is very similarly to how we were doing our macros, you can do a set driven key to be like, turn on this blend shape when this joint rotates. So you can get it to like mush and deform in these cool ways as it's rotating so that your finger looks really, really real. I wouldn't worry about that for this project. I would just try and get your joint deformations as close as possible. So your hand at rest, I would bring in a fresh copy and start from there. Because this is going to be very, very hard to work with. It's going to be very hard to rig. Oh, I think you're muted.
I had so I had the main one here, 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 and here, but then I guess I added one here so I could like try to like move everything again without moving like this part of the hand, and then like I don't know. I guess maybe I was adding too many joints in the thumb.
Yeah,
I was trying to like
the thumb and the finger should have the same number of joints. It's just that the way that so like this joint in your pointer is the one that's basically right next to your wrist. So even though like this finger, when it bends kind of at the big meaty part of the hand here, that's actually technically the second joint. The first joint is way inside of the meat, and so that's how you're getting that deformation. So you really should only need 1, 2, 3 joints to get all the bends you need for all 5 digits. So the thumb should have a base, the second joint and third joint. Pointer has a base, second joint, a third joint, so on and so forth.
Okay. Cool. So I guess the answer is start over and
well, let me see. So we've got a poly reduce, we've got a transform. We've got some color sets. Huh. Tweak. Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a little bit tricky to unwind.
Right.
If your joints are all in the right place, are you happy with your joint placement?
I guess after I started to like, I was thinking about when I was making them that fingers went like this, you know. But if I wanted to make them sort of like running, if you look at, I guess you undid it, but like the ring finger, once I like started moving the ring finger, I guess further back than like I wanted it to, it was like creating this like straight line down while this is bending backwards. If that makes any sense.
Like this?
Yeah, sorry, the ring finger. Yeah, right there. It was where I wanted it to be, but then like I do want it to like have like almost like a rubber hosey sort of bend and not the way it needs to go. So I don't know if that requires maybe like an extra joint in there to like make it keep it like together while also like breaking the finger, you know?
Okay. Yeah, I think so. This is getting into kind of a different category of the kind of technical art stuff, which is topology and how and where joints get placed. So all we really talked about is putting the joint kind of in a specific place on the finger. And there's a big reason for that. So if you subdivision height. Okay, so imagine this is your finger. If you only have one division, or
it's gonna do like a V if you bend it, right?
Yeah, basically it would look awful. If you add in just kind of 2 more edges and you kind of go like that, then you can start to maintain some of the volume of the shape. And the way that happens is, I'll dial this down to 8. So it's closer. Oh, okay. 1 second. Doesn't like when you modify stuff. There we go. All right. So imagine this is your finger. You've got, let me put in some joints. Where's my joints? Freaking joint. All right, so you'll have base and then middle and it's very, very tiny. Okay, cool. Now you can see what's going on. So if I skim this thing and I look at the weight distribution, so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and just flood everything to the base joint to start. So now if I rotate, everything follows. If I rotate this, nothing happens. The next thing that I'll do is add 100% influence to these things here at the end. So now when I rotate, you can see this end thing is maintaining, well, kind of still got, it's basically maintaining don't know why it's being so difficult. Maintaining perfect volume at the end, but then this area is all getting mushed up, right? And so that's not what you would want for the deformation of your finger. So the important feature for changing that is kind of where this second edge is going to greatly affect the maintaining of volume after wherever the joint is. So the joint pivots right here at the middle. So this is their pivot point, right? So in general, you're always going to want an edge ring to fall right where your joint is. Because what you can do with that is shift this closer. So now everything after that maintains volume. Yeah?
Okay.
Okay. So when you go to paint weights, I'll go to select mode just so it's for sure. Select that edge ring, select that edge ring, select my joint if I can, and then dial that up to 100. So now if I rotate, you can see it's basically maintaining the whole volume all the way at the end. But what you get is here this like little weird stuff underneath. So in general, this is the dance that you'll want to do. Let me get a couple more steps in order. So the other thing you would want to do is shift up a deformation thing. So this edge ring before will help maintain the volume of all of these faces. So what you can do is paint weights tool, go to select mode, edge, make sure that stuff is selected, make sure your joint's selected, make sure that's good. Cool. So now what you have is a good starting point for kind of what you would want for a finger, for finger topology. This can also be used for like a knee. This is pretty good for a knee. It's not great for a shoulder. It's decent for an elbow. Like each area is going to have a little bit of a different alignment and formation. And so yeah, that's kind of a good starting point. So what you would want to do at this juncture is start to do your best to distribute stuff in a way that kind of, this is very harsh. It's pretty good, but it's very harsh, right? So what you can do is do the 50-50 trick with this middle thing where put 100% influence to start, then deselect that joint, select the previous joint, and say 50%. So see now how you get, it's not quite as harsh. So as you're bending, turn this on so you can see. So as you're bending, you can see it's maintaining the volume pretty good. So the final step in this is usually you come in to the bottom, which is where most of the deformation in a finger happens. It's the underside. The top usually behaves pretty well. The bottom is a little tricky. So what you can do is, this is when
I'm sort of thinking about them as like toys and how you like connect, how I would connect like a finger toy. So like the wrist might go a little bit over here, but then like give a little bit more.
That's a really good way of thinking about, like, if you were to look at the influence of the joint, that would be what the influence looks like in the heat map, like in paint mode, right? So you can see the gray influence of this stuff. So to smooth stuff out, to get to do like the kind of like final tweaks, I'll do the select mode for blocking everything, because I know for sure I'm like 100% on this. There's no dangling weights on the fingertips, like nothing. Then what I'll do is use the add tool in paint mode and set this to something really, really small, like 0.01. So now when I come in and I just click, it just does the ever so slightly little bits of influence on verts that it doesn't currently have influence on. And then I'll switch over to the next joint and do the same thing on a few of the verts that it doesn't have influence on. Then once there's like a little bit of influence on each of them, this is when you can come in and use the smooth tool, and it will actually behave a little bit better because it knows, okay, there is some influence here and there is some influence here. So I'll just try and balance those two. If there isn't any, then it will just randomly fire some weights onto some joint as best it can, but it's the computer, so it doesn't know. So now that you've kind of given it this basis of like, there's a little bit here, it's mostly here, you can come in with smooth and adjust the opacity to either do lots all at once, or sometimes what I'll do is set it to 0.25 and then just kind of gently smooth stuff. Until it's
yeah, I wasn't
good.
messing with the value at all. I was just doing opacity and like tapping it.
Gotcha, yeah.
And that worked out pretty good.
So now you can step through kind of the different levels of bend for your fingers, where, you know, at the top there's nothing, so it should look exactly how the original shape should be. Then if you are at like, you know, a quarter, you're at like a quarter bend, how's it looking? Like, is it moving in the right way? It's like, yeah, that's pretty good. Like, it would affect this just a little bit. This is 100%, like this is working really good. And then you're like, what would happen in an extreme pose, like 90 degrees? Like, starts to collapse quite a, it's like losing some volume here. So sometimes what you can do in this case is, if you have the bandwidth with animation, usually do, you don't have to worry about vert count quite as much. You could add in one last edge ring kind of here, right? And so you may need to unbind and rebind at this point because you don't want to do such drastic topology modifications while keeping it all bound up. But what this tells you is basically, if you do all that paint operation and kind of smoothing and stuff to these three rings, and you add in one last edge ring, you'll get really good maintaining of volume in this side because that last edge ring is holding it perfectly, and then really good maintaining of volume here on that second thing. So then you really get a really nice deformation where you're maintaining good volume above and below, and these things, this edge ring, this edge ring, and this edge ring, are distributed nicely. So you're getting that nice even bending of everything. So in looking at your hand, I think one of the reasons that you're getting this strange deformation is, number one, the joint isn't centered on an edge ring, and then you don't have the surrounding edge rings to help maintain that volume. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. So you may want to, I do think you're going to have to start again with this hand, but taking a look at, in the second pass, where you're going to place your joints. If you're doing the topology stuff, have specific edge rings. You're like, this is where the joint's going to go here. This is where the joint's going to go here. And then go through that process in your mind. Do I have the bandwidth for whatever this is going to be? This is an animation. Yes, I can add in a few edge rings. How many edge rings is too many before it starts to become untenable and you're having to paint thousands of verts and it's really annoying? Maybe just 1 or 2 edge rings versus 10, right? Cool.
Cool. Yeah, I think I might abandon, I guess, my hand and work with yours. But
well, I
cool.
mean, I think it's a really good exercise to go through modeling a hand. And if I unbind this, oh, what the heck? Can I not unbind this? There we go. You've got pretty good edge flow on the thumb area. Like, I like that you have. I can
resend a not messed up version.
Oh yeah, do you want to drop that in the drive real quick?
Sure. think it's this one, and you'll have to reduce the polygons, I think, by 80.
Is it in there?
Yes, this is that it's uploaded.
Okay, take a look. Not quite. Let me know when it's done uploading.
It says that it's been up there for a while.
It's been up there? Okay. Let me force this. It says everything's up to date.
I can send you the link to it.
Huh, weird. In the chat? Okay. Let me just
Yeah, I think so.
This save file. Okay, cool. Yeah, I would recommend also not having turbo smooth on when you're rigging. It will, I guess, unless you use 2 instead of 3, you won't really know where the actual position of a vert is, and it can make painting weights pretty annoying because you'll be like, I'm smoothing it and nothing's happening, and that's because the vert is actually over here and you're not actually painting it. So I go ahead and just leave 1, like just normal view mode on. Yeah, this, do you use ZBrush to make this?
Yeah, and then I just reduced the polygons by like 80 in Maya.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see. Oink. These are a little foldy. Let's draw. A little too wrong. There we go. Strength.
Okay, that was causing me issues too.
So in the Maya stuff, its sculpting tools are decent. They're certainly not as good as ZBrush, because that's ZBrush's bag. But the ones that I tend to use basically exclusively are Move, which is this one, or Grab Tool, I guess is what it's called. Foamy Tool, which is kind of like Inflate in ZBrush, and then the Freeze Tool. So those are the kind of 3 that I use. And if you combine those, or the where I use Inflate is in situations like this, where it's kind of hard to grab and pull. Instead, if you just push it along the Z axis of wherever the normal is, so wherever the polygon is angled, its normal is that direction. So that's what this tool does, is it pushes it in the direction that it's currently facing. So with a finger, you can kind of inflate it. So it'll push it out towards the other finger, which is kind of what you end up wanting in the end. Let's see, but yeah, you may. So one other thing you can do which is a super powerful tool, and which is a workflow that I use all the time, would be using this as a, oh, okay, hold on, gotta knock this back into place a little bit. There we go. That's looking a little better. Is the quad draw. Have you used that at all? Okay, so now that you have this, you can use this as your base, and you can be very, very deliberate with your topology in Maya, more so than ZBrush. So how you get started is you just activate your little modeling toolkit menu. Quad draw is down here. Before you select that tool, you want to make this a live surface, which makes it sticky, because then you can just draw directly on here with polygons instead of like free form moving verts in space. To do that, you can just click this little magnet right here, or you can say modify, or is modify, isn't it? Make live. Yeah, sorry, right there. Boom. So when you do that, now this is live, and you can't actually select it anymore or edit it, because it's just a reference thing. So with quad draw, you can draw points and then hold shift, and now you have a new polygon. So you could be very, very, very deliberate with, like, I want the middle of my finger to be there, the corner of my finger to be here, and then there's one in the middle. And really get, oh, hold on. Boop, boop, boop. Put these out, and then drag these to kind of where you would want your, maybe your middle joint is like right there. That. And then you can use these to just add in some divisions. So you can be really, really quick and fast with making new clean topology exactly how you want, if you want to go that route. And in the end, what you'll end up with is an optimized rig that has specific topology for animation versus just a prop. So if you are going to spend a bunch of time fixing your hand and working with stuff, you could just, make sure that this, and to deactivate, like to make it not live, just click the magnet again, and then it goes back to just being a normal thing. All those polygons that I just made become their own little poly surface, selectable and makeable over here. So I'll just delete that real quick. So what you could do in theory, spend a bunch of time getting this hand looking exactly how you want, and then deliberately draw out specific polygons on it as a way, instead of coming in, picking verts, using whatever tools you can to push stuff and pull stuff, or being like, oh, I want to reduce, get rid of these edges, and using, delete edges and all that kind of stuff. That's, I think, less efficient, and also it'll change the shape of stuff as you get rid of things. So it's an option if you want to go down that road. If you want to just stick with the hand that's in there, that was my intention, was to make more focus on the joints and the controls in the first one than the making of the character. If you are comfortable with making the joints and painting the weights, you're like, that part will go quick, then you could probably spend some time making your own hand if you want. Also, you could just modify the hand that's there to have the extra stump, so then you can have your tail.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was thinking about doing, is getting your hand and maybe just adding like a cylinder and giving it the arm. But yeah, I think it was a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, and all this stuff is just practice, trying it out. I from what I see, usually the first time people go through stuff, everything's a question mark, so only so much stuff sticks. Then the second time you go through, there are way less question marks, and so you can actually talk about things a little bit better. So now that you've gone through making a hand and trying to do stuff, when I talk about topology or things in the future, you'll probably you'll remember more stuff just because you've gone through some of the things.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Kirby. I'm gonna get some lunch.
All right. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Bye.
Oh, unless other people have a question before I sign out? No? Okay. Later.